I was trying to think of a good line to start with. I started with Harold and his story about a line, and I thought maybe a poetic line, or a cheesy chat-up line, or an actual line, or a plot line, or a movie line, and then, this is an excellent line. It's kind of a plot line, really. It's about society and big data and normativity and machine intelligence and utilitarian ethics and hate speech. And it's also about inclusion. Hi, by the way. And you can turn it into a graph, and suddenly it describes distribution. This bell shape is the normal distribution curve, which is nice if you're into statistics. I made up some data to fill it in. Hope that's okay. Oh, come on. We've all done that. Well, for this talk, let's just say that this is the Platonic ideal of a distribution curve. It's hypothetical. It's completely harmless. I did check this out on Wikipedia. Turns out only 5% of everything is not that normal, which seems legit, but it's good to put a figure on it. So that means about 95% must be normal, and that must be a relief. Anyway, that's pretty much all I know about statistics. Thank you for coming to my lightning talk. Oh, okay, well, as the kids say, this chart is extremely varied, and it really does turn up everywhere, like birth weight, blood pressure, card games, dice throws, probably. Or is that probability? Probability, probably. Stock markets, income distribution, eventually even things that we invent, like IQ or school grades, obviously. In fact, there's whole schools of statistics devoted to fixing your data if it isn't normal, so that it still works, which is fascinating, and I wish that worked on my boss. Normativity is a fundamental of machine learning, or AI as well. We call it machine learning because artificial intelligence scares people, whereas machine learning sounds safe and sensible and boringly academic. Fixing your data does not sound like a concept you hear much, except perhaps from your parents, but we can come back to that part. For me, this curve describes privilege. Every culture has a normal centered around social consensus. And we all do pretend normativity. We all speak properly, or we pretend we're straight, or we laugh at a family joke. It's code switching. We all want to seem normal, to fit in. Everyone wants that, and they do tend to get funny if you call them common or typical, but normal is fine. It's also a maths term and an abstract idea, and we shouldn't use it to stigmatize people we don't like. Here's another line about inclusion. Inclusion is a process, and the hard work is actually in the learning of acknowledging and accommodating. Accommodation is Kafkaesque if you're on the wrong side of it. But when you see yourself being accommodated, when people trust you to accept you as you are, when everyone, all of us, all of you, feel their needs are understood and acknowledged, then that's normal, right? Even if those needs can't always be met. I get to talk about this because I'm trans. Yay! As it goes, I'm also autistic, and face blind, and bisexual, and disabled, and mentally ill, and I have an autoimmune condition, and some days that feels like a lot to try and explain to folks, so let's just stick with being trans. This is much better. This is my preferred version of my transition story. This is like the Netflix version. And I do have the benefit of multiple perspectives. I do know what it's like to be perceived as a straight white man, and what it means to have that privilege removed, what happens when you talk about mental illness. But people want numbers, they want averages, and I appreciate that that's technically correct, but it doesn't look like anyone at all. So the least normal person appears to be someone who is normal, and our graph can't look like that if we had 14 or 15 dimensions of data. So I guess that's one way of saying that normal doesn't exist. And why? Like, no one else makes the world or runs the businesses. It's literally in our image. The rich and the powerful, that's you. It's in your hands. There are no gods of inequality, only humans. But that's awkward. Let's talk about cake again. Diversity is like sharing a cake. Inclusion is like sharing it equally. Equity is actually getting the cake. It's the tricky middle child. It's so neglected. That's kind of awkward too. Let's talk about machine learning. Recursive pattern recognition, or adversarial pattern recognition. It's all pattern recognition to determine for itself, the machine, what is common or normal. It's not magic. It's not conscious. It resolves boring analytical questions and finds new patterns and creates new types of data. And all of that uses data, and so to find the data we tend to go to the internet. At the internet we find sets of information to train and validate those models, but they tend to underrepresent, as you know, groups who fall outside of normal. No one can see when it's bad, even when you're the one being excluded. I mean, in science we have examples like autism, which was assumed to be at a ratio of 9 men for every 1 woman until the mid-90s. And research funds expected that to be factored in. But then the errors proved that the ratio was wrong, so they were corrected. And that's in science. So, normativity. Here's an example. It's an easy example from a project of ours that I love. The Quick Draw is an experiment from the team in New York that they built a few years ago that uses a neural net, which is machine learning, to learn what an object is and to recognise it as you draw it. And as you would assume, it gets better and better at that the more people draw and the more drawing it gets. And after a few years of that, it had millions of drawings to learn from. So when you've got 1 million bananas, or hundreds of thousands of bananas, and you're asking humans at this stage as well to correct them, those bananas begin to tell you something. Machine learning can show you that everything looks like a banana. Even bell curves look like a banana. Cats, slightly different. It's just that we're able to understand lots of different things as a cat, even if they're not that similar. So lots of things can represent a cat, and we have a very broad notion of catness that includes all the cats. Shoes, more tricky. Because most people like to draw one kind of shoe, it becomes possible for the machine to create ideas of what a normal shoe looks like. And that means it begins to exclude abnormal shoes, like these ones on the right, which are my shoes, the ones I draw, the stilettos, obviously. And we use machine learning to find patterns that we would recognise, but they're looking for things that humans can't recognise, so we get those kind of results. They see the data honestly, but we ask them to discriminate like a human would because we want to understand the answer. And if we don't understand, we blame the machine. We ignore the elephant in the room, speaking as an autistic woman. Human history is a timeline of those kind of assumptions or common sense prejudices. But it turns out the sun doesn't go round the earth, and the colour of your skin does not indicate your intelligence, and that women should be paid the same as men. Once upon a time, these ideas were not actually a given. With regard to transgender people and the LGBTQ community, we've seen quite rapid change in our culture and what feels like common sense. But that isn't true everywhere. Even some of those last examples haven't reached the whole world. With internet data, we're talking about billions of opinions, not just ours. You and how you see the world is not normal. Inclusion has a consequential effect because it breaks down assumptions of normativity, and we're not built to do that. And while we might be teaching our kids how to do that, and that's great, we're not teaching our machines yet. We can't teach them values, only results. So it's not bad developers, it's not bad machines, it's not big tech, it's systemic, which is frustrating because AI is smarter than that, can be smarter than that. I did actually just want to use that transition. But ethics is so impossibly difficult. Even if we get past the issue of asking legal terms and policymakers to solve historic philosophical paradox, which is a little bit like asking realtors to adjudicate human rights abuses, even if they could, there's never been a point in human history where we've had a consensus view on what the right thing to do is. I wanted to give this presentation because it's from 2018, and I tried not to change it because so little has changed. But the meaning changed for me. I hope it's not too confusing. The erasure part seems secondary now, to the unremarked demise of qualitative value. Today, one non-fungible token, an NFT, can be worth millions of dollars, but we can't denote the value of the non-fungibility. We haven't a system for the value of belonging or the intensity of pain or the thing you feel when your brain is actually working. We can't assess beauty or taste or deliciousness. We've given the right to judge not to machines but to quanta. Not everything can be measured. Not everything can be counted or calculated or computed. Politics and success and merit and ethics can't be counted. But you all have metric goals for inclusion, that you can't succeed unless you have the numbers. And so you can't succeed. We need ways to describe value in order for people to be included, for them to be valued. To measure our worth, we need better metrics than percentage or profit. inclusion as an objective requires language that allows us to assess but not compare. Maybe I'm too literal. I am autistic after all. But I like subjective quality. It's a value I don't think any artificial system can be taught. And yet everything must be counted, because otherwise it's impossible, somehow, to gauge its value, which means that value can only be represented by quantity. And that's just not true.